Great. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. Let me get the slides set up and going here. I got it here. So what I'd like to tell you about tonight is a journey that I've been involved on for 3.5 years. It's not a journey I got involved in out of my own making. When I got a telephone call one Saturday morning from one of our county supervisors in Marin County, where I have a ranch, and he asked me if I would help him sort out some science, I did what I hope everyone else in this room would do. He said, will you read some papers and come to a hearing in 8 days and tell us what you think these scientific papers mean? And I said, okay. I thought I was making an 8-day commitment. And here it is 3.5 years later. But what you're going to hear is a journey that's taken place that's actually led me as high as the White House and all over our federal government. It's a story that really isn't about that beautiful body of water called Drake Sestero, and it's not really about oysters and about seals. What it really is about our government and how our government uses science, what it does with science, and how it takes predetermined agendas. Now, at the bottom I give you a quote that all of you know from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. Policy is opinion. I don't have any special role in policy over any of you. Any kind of policy decision, particularly as it regards to land use, there'll be different opinions, different people will have that. That's the political arena. What happens, though, is when you get a set of people who have a predetermined agenda that want that policy decision to go one way rather than the other, and they start using science to do it. Whether that's ClimateGate or anything else that gets published in Science Magazine or anywhere else that we hear about, it's what happens when you have people who have a predetermined agenda and they decide they're going to use science to force the policy debate one way or the other. And in this case, what happens is that a scientist, in this case it was me, it could have been any one of you, got involved in this issue. And let me show you what happens with the government in this case. Now I want to just give you a little bit of background about what's happening in our government when it comes to scientific integrity, to these issues of trust and accountability. First of all, as an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, I was as pleased as I think every member of the Academy was when back on April 27th, 2009, we listened to Barack Obama give a lecture to the Academy. To my knowledge, it was the first time since John F. Kennedy that a sitting president had lectured the National Academy of Sciences. And what he said that day was very inspiring, especially after going through 8 years in which many of us questioned the way science was used in the federal government. Now, I give you a couple of his quotes here. We are restoring science to its rightful place. The days of science taking a backseat to ideology are over. I want to make sure that facts are driving scientific decisions and not the other way around. It was inspiring. It got a standing ovation by the National Academy of Sciences. The question is, no matter how good are his ideals and the ideals of John Holdren, his science advisor, or of Steve Chu and some others in his administration, how much can they actually affect the agencies and the entire culture of the federal government they've inherited? And what I'm going to show you tonight is that, with regret, I would tell you they can't do a very good job of that. And that what's going on today in the Obama administration is very sadly not so different than things that went on many years before, particularly in the Department of Interior. Now, when I first got involved in this, I give you some quotes from a talk that I gave, just to say that this is what moved me. I don't care about oysters. The guy who happens to own this particular oyster farm, I had never met. I'd never actually met the guy before I got involved in this. I was asked by my county supervisor, Corey, would you read the science? We're worried that some of these claims against the oyster farm might be cooked. We're not scientists. We trust you. Would you read this? And why did he trust me? I had gotten involved. Many of you may know I've had a major role in public policy. First, my wife was a science journalist. Some of you know that. She worked for Science Magazine for almost 2 decades as their West Coast bureau head. But more to the point for myself, I chaired the Board on Life Sciences of the National Research Council for 6 years. I was on that board for a number of years before. I've been very involved. Susan brought me onto CCST, and I've been very involved in some local issues out in West Marin. And the county supervisors have turned to me a number of times in the last 17 years and asked me to help them sort out issues where science is interfacing with public policy. So that was my infamous Saturday morning when I got a call and asked if I would get involved in this. Now, before I tell you about the issue, let me tell you about the history of scientific misconduct and scientific integrity. Some of us will remember back in the 1980s when there was no policy. Some guys at NIH named Fetter and Stewart, I remember Walter Stewart well, I knew him, there were a number of cases at the National Institutes of Health where individual people looked like they were actually fabricating data. You'll remember there were some mice that may even had some stripes painted on them and whatnot. And there were a lot of issues that we needed to actually have proper laws that had to do with scientific integrity. This was eventually taken to the National Academy of Sciences, and they rightfully gave it to the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, called COSAPUP, initially commissioned in 1989. It took them 3 years. In 1992, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report, Responsible Science and Ensuring the Integrity of the Research Process, where they came out with the first definition of scientific integrity and scientific misconduct. To this day, it passes the test of time. I mean, there's been a lot of wordsmithing, but our fellow scientists did a great job. Now, what happened? They recommended this should be the policy for the entire federal government and all federally funded research. Things don't move that quickly in Washington, as some of you know better than me. It took 8 years. During the 1990s, there were debates about the exact definition, the wordsmithing, enforcement. You're going to see enforcement is a huge issue. It's great to have a policy, but if there's no one there to enforce it, it's an empty policy and it means nothing. And would it apply to all federally funded research? Where would it apply? NIH came up with a policy, NSF. Now I'm going to fast forward. The final days of the Clinton administration. They didn't pull a fast one. They started, and they actually had a policy that they put out for public comment. When Bruce Albers here was head of the National Academy of Sciences, he commented in a very thoughtful way, so did a lot of other people. They got a lot of comments in, and in December 6th of 2000, the White House, Office of Science and Technology Policy, put in the Federal Register the President's policy on research misconduct. And this was the federal policy for the entire federal government. And what they said, I won't read you the details. Any of you are, of course, welcome to these slides and the references. But what they said at the end is agencies will have 1 year to implement this policy. What they were saying is they weren't going to claim to say how you had to adjudicate. They said, here's the definition of misconduct, what it means to fabricate or falsify data, et cetera. But they said every agency had 1 year and had to come up with a policy. Well, many of the agencies that most of us deal with all the time, like NIH, through Health and Human Services, and NSF, came up with a policy within a year. I actually naively thought the Department of Interior came up with a policy because 6 or 7 years later, when I first got involved in this topic, you could go online, as I did, and Google, and you could come up with a code of scientific conduct from the Department of Interior. It was on a website. It just winds up that the secretary had never signed it, and it was a meaningless piece of paper because it had never become the rules of the Department of Interior, as the Inspector General educated me on. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. It winds up that, anyways, there was no policy in Interior. There was no policy in the Bush years in a number of different departments. Now, I know this because I got very involved, as I'm going to tell you, and I got to know that the folks, that going back to the Carter administration, each of the different agencies has an inspector general that's supposed to be looking after them, where you're supposed to be able to take complaints, all sorts of complaints. The Department of the Interior has an inspector general's office. I got to know the assistant inspector general of enforcement, John Dupuy. In fact, hopefully he's going to come join us in February because he's very thoughtful on this topic. And when they eventually looked at the topic I'm going to tell you about, I actually thought that the actual code had been broken in Interior. And he educated me, and they looked it up, and they said, Corey, that may be posted on the website, but the Secretary of Interior actually never signed it. It is not the rule of Interior. They've broken the federal law. They don't have a policy. So the first thing we discovered was that there was no policy in Interior. There was no policy in the National Park Service, which was very interesting. And it's actually gotten literally up to the past few weeks. Because of what I'm about to tell you about and some complaints I put in. I put in a 72-page complaint about scientific misconduct in December of 2007. That led to suddenly an interim policy, because the Inspector General was looking at this, January 31st, 2008. It's a very weak policy, but it was an interim policy because the National Park Service was on the line with the Inspector General looking into it, of realizing this is 8 years after the fact of when you were supposed to have a policy, and there wasn't no policy. So they put in an interim policy. Now, just recently in April, this has gotten so serious that by April of 2010, the Inspector General of the Department of Interior came out with a report, and if you can't read it, it says Interior lacks a scientific integrity policy. Well, I could have told them that from a couple of years ago. We discovered that together. And it says such things as that there's no requirement to track scientific misconduct allegations. Boy, you'll see that in spades in a few minutes. If you think you can just be a whistleblower and claim there's scientific misconduct, I'll enlighten you on that. The risk that flawed information will reach the scientific community and general public is great. Yes, yes, yes. And they gave 3 examples. They gave 3 examples in Interior of why you desperately needed an integrity policy. One of them I give you right below is, of course, what came out of my complaint, which they say in another example, a National Park Service senior science advisor and so on. I won't read you the words, but questions about scientific integrity. Well, just to bring you up to date, literally a few weeks ago, Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar, he's been on the hot seat about this. I'll show you some of the reasons why, some of the things I've taken to him and that the White House has pushed him on. As far as I understand, they don't actually still have a policy, but they've got a press release and maybe something that's going to be a policy. There's still some unclarity about enforcement and issues. I don't want to dwell too much in the details here, but I will say this is September 27th, and at least Salazar announced for the first time, this is only close to 10 years after it was said they had to have a policy within 1 year, says there will now be clear and unambiguous codes of conduct for scientific activities and use of science in decision making. Allegations of misconduct will be investigated. Needless to say, when you're done listening to me tonight, I hope that perhaps they'll now investigate what I'm about to tell you, because it's been kind of lonely for 3.5 years with Interior not having a policy.